All right. As everyone may know, I am unashamedly a proud Filipino. And because I love my country so much, because I think as well that for debate purposes, the Philippines is a very, very good example of recent geopolitical tensions and challenges for the 21st century, I tested three different but similar Philippine motions in three consecutive pre-Worlds tournaments. So in this video, I'll be processing each and every one of them. And while you are going through this video, I also hope that you will realize not just about how amazing the Philippines is, but how rich debate can be if you get a bit more creative about things. If you focus on certain nuances and angles, and how certain changes can transform an entire debate. So go prep these motions as we go along. And even if you currently know nothing about the Philippines, that's okay. That's good. First, you should read more. That's your obligation, that's your duty. But also, this is a good challenge. This is a very good challenge to practice debates where you can still make arguments without knowing anything, so long as you utilize the info side effectively and think critically. All right. The first motion was from Diliman Debate Open 2023. The info slide reads, Bongbong Marcos is the current president of the Republic of the Philippines. The military and uniform personnel pension system covers individuals from the military, coastal guard, police, prison guards, etc. It is financed entirely by the national budget and unlike other pension programs requires no contributions from its beneficiaries. Under the previous administration, MUP pensions doubled as part of Duterte's campaign or his campaign promises to align with military lobbyists. However, under the current Marcos administration, several economic advisors and members of Congress have pushed for a significant overhaul of military pensions as part of an effort to increase government savings. And so the motion reads, this House believes that it is in the interest of Bongbong Marcos to veto all attempts to reduce military pensions. So of course, there's a lot to unpack here. What happens when military pensions are reduced? What are the legislative attempts to reduce military pensions? And what happens if BBM, or Bongbong Marcos, vetoes these attempts? And ultimately, how is this connected to BBM's interest? For this motion, specialized knowledge that would help aid you in this debate would be the Duterte and Marcos political dynasties united under a super coalition to beat the opposition, and they currently have a tense existing relationship with BBM as president and Sara Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte's daughter, as vice president. And as is highlighted in the info slide, Duterte's war on drugs was premised by a close relationship with the military, bolstered by repeated attempts to increase military pensions, and evidenced by support for their ambitions to join the political arena with people like Bato de la Rosa, who's currently a senator and was Duterte's chief of police. On the other hand, BBM's cabinet, consisting of several economic experts and intellectuals that come from academia and from a more technocrat background, they've all recommended to reduce military pensions in an effort not only to just bolster his own economic projects, but to improve government savings and also help the recovery from COVID. So there is obviously a delicate balancing act here. And this motion asks whether BBM should take a more aggressive stance or risk the success of his own presidency, considering future political alliances that may or may not emerge in the near future, or even considering BBM's attempts to pander to a majority of Filipinos, which include moderates that were part of the Philippine opposition, which include a lot of these individuals from the from an intellectual academia, social civic groups. So how did participants do for this round, if you are curious? On screen right now is a statistical summary of the X debates or the numbers of people that did this motion. And as you can see, it was a very balanced motion. And even if participants didn't know the intricate details of the BBM administration, the internal dynamics are still there. And even if conceptually it seems to be quite a straightforward discussion with respect to the military pensions issue, like whether increasing it or decreasing it is good or bad, making it about BBM makes for a very, very enriching, fair debate, in my opinion. And that's a good lesson to take from this particular motion, because setting a nuanced motion like this does work. And this was a very, very large tournament. Like Diliman Debate Open was one of the largest tournaments of the year. And I'm very, very happy to see that the reception was very, very well. The second motion was from Monash Pre-World 2023. The info side again reads, Bongbong Marcos is the current president of the Philippines. Under the administration of Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippines pulled out of the International Criminal Court. and has since rejected all efforts to cooperate with an investigation probe on the extrajudicial killings under the administration's war on drugs. And the motion reads, this House believes that it is in the interest of Bongbong Marcos to fully cooperate with an ICC probe on the drug war of the previous Duterte administration. And again, I'm sure you're noticing a trend. A lot to unpack here. This is again a debate about BBM's interest, and this time focused more neatly on the existing ICC investigation that Duterte and BBM have collectively and consistently rejected, on the basis that the ICC only has a mandate to intervene if the existing judicial systems are failing, which is empirically not the case, of course, but it is the claim and the defense that is being done by the existing administration. Specialized knowledge that would help aid you in this debate would be: the ICC investigation, of course, is targeted against Duterte's political allies, many of which are still in power today. But note that Marcos also still won on a campaign to continue the war on drugs because it was a massively popular campaign platform from his and Duterte's base. And that while BBM has somewhat sidelined Sara Duterte a lot by giving her a relatively weak cabinet position in the Department of Education, the influence of the Duterte family is still significant. Furthermore, the Philippines' relationship with the ICC is also critical here. After all, the Philippines not so long ago used The Hague to affirm and file and eventually win their territorial claims in the South China Sea, much of which were claims that were completely abandoned or forgone by the Duterte administration. But now, as part of BBM's more open diplomacy with the US, the United States, he's been more outspoken in challenging China's aggression in the contested waters. And so adding more friction to the ICC's process in the region is also going to fracture those relationships too. And lastly, it's critical to know that while this debate is not about whether the war on drugs was good or bad, it's necessarily about how BBM wants to talk about the legacy of the war on drugs in the Philippines and for his own administration, especially in the way he positions any future cooperation with the moderate Philippine opposition, who also operate many of the NGOs and social civic organizations that cater to many of these victims of the war on drugs. And one thing to remember here is that lots of those that voted for Duterte's campaigns were themselves victims of that war on drugs, which displaced a lot of their support towards the opposition, or simply because they had no other option. So of course, that is another element to consider here too. And for this motion, the motion balance looked as follows. Looking at it right now, still relatively balanced from a government to opposition perspective, but admittedly relatively more imbalanced towards the closing teams, and particularly closing opposition, who, as you can notice in the slide, took the most firsts by a clear margin. This tells me that for a motion like this, it likely took more time for closing teams to formulate a more cohesive case, and given the limited details in the info side compared to the previous motion, this was a more challenging one that leaned towards a closing bias because it was easier to weigh and add more material and win when a team later got the right case. And as an AdCore, like looking at this right now, this tells me that the motion is obviously not that intuitive on first glance. Like for example, why would BBM cooperate with the ICC? Should more details in the info side be added to help close opening teams, especially opening government? These are good dilemmas to ask, especially if you want to make it more balanced. But I would defer at this moment to think that this is a problem of teams not knowing enough information and being properly punished for it if they did not know much about the Philippines. And I think this is evident because it was still relatively balanced from a government to opposition perspective. And that is okay. If that problem stems from that particular issue of lack of matter loading and people just maximizing it in the closing half, that is also perfectly fine. Finally, the last motion was from Sydney Mini 2023. And I'll just note later for the statistics, like it was just only 8 rooms, but that's perfectly fine for this one. I just want to talk about the motion for this one as well. The info side is Bongbong Marcos is the current president of the Philippines. The Philippines and China have conflicting claims to territorial waters in the South China Sea. Strategic ambiguity is the practice by a government of deliberately being ambiguous about how it will pursue its goals and how it will respond to actions by other states. And so the motion reads, this House believes that it is in the interest of BBM to take a position of strategic ambiguity with respect to defending the Philippines' territorial claims on the South China Sea. I already mentioned a bit about the South China Sea dispute in the previous motion, and so hopefully by now you're realizing that doing more motions in the same topic brings and recurs the same clashes, but in a very creative and different perspective or with different nuances that you can exploit. With this motion being particularly about whether a position of strategic ambiguity is in the interest of BBM. And so the specialized knowledge that would help aid you in this debate would be the Marcos family has historically had a love hate relationship with the US, primarily depending on the administration that is in power. Remember that BBM ran on a campaign of nostalgia on his father's dictatorship period of martial law, one that he is actively he ran on to sustain several of his disinformation networks, to ride on the historical revisionism, to hide many of these abuses, and to run away from the legal cases of ill-gotten wealth against his family. With respect to the US has actively protected, or historically has protected, the Marcos family during the martial law era, and even when Marcos fled the country after the EDSA revolution. And on the other hand, the Marcoses were banned several times from going to the US for a long time because their family was prosecuted in the courts for ill-gotten wealth when they were no longer in power for a long time. And even under the Duterte administration, again, a political family that is still very influential in the Philippines today, they distanced themselves a lot from the US because of Duterte's actively closer ties with China, in spite of initially saying he would defend Philippine waters, but not necessarily doing anything about it, even welcoming more Chinese investment into the Philippines. And so one of the best arguments for government in this motion is that strategic ambiguity is a very good balancing act for BBM's moderate position between China and the US, given US uncertainty and increasing Chinese aggression that could be met with joint economic cooperation instead. Whereas a very good argument for opposition is simply that taking a stronger position is not only politically good for BBM's closer ties with the US, in his position to rekindle ties with Biden that were previously broken apart with Trump and Duterte, but instead, it's good for bolstering military security, and it's also domestically popular to give BBM the pretense to justify more militarization or more martial law in an attempt for BBM to fully embrace and capitalize on the nostalgia and position himself as a strongman leader that can outshine Duterte's influence as well, because that's also part of how BBM wants to frame his legacy. Taking a look at the motion balance briefly for a tournament with 8 rooms, it was most definitely good. Even for a relatively smaller tournament, every team had 2 firsts, and the only glaring imbalance is one between opening government and closing government, where it seems opening government scored a significant amount of seconds, and opening and closing government got a disproportionate number of fourths. And from an AGCOR perspective, if closing government is doing very poorly in a round that is relatively balanced, then it must be the case that a lot of depth in the motion was inaccessible to teams, which may be credited to the fact that most of the info side was exploited by OG and CG, by OG, and CG was not able to capitalize on anything else because they just did not have that information. And so if the debate, again, as when I witnessed, becomes more of a debate on whether China will escalate aggression or not, and not whether about this is going to allow BBM to strengthen his own political status by balancing Chinese and US interests at the same time, then it is simply no surprise that opening government was pretty sure in a motion like this. And even closing opposition was fairly secure because of a similar reason, that even if the depth is not that accessible, they have more room to play along the basic debate against OG because they have more time and do not rely on maximizing the depth of that motion. And yeah, I'll admit, for this motion, I accept that it should be the case that teams should be challenged to go beyond the superficial debate. And in fact, making it an actor debate motion for BBM opens up some room for closing to do that, so long as they can truly capitalize on the specialized knowledge too. So again, it's not just a China versus US debate or just a China is gonna escalate tension or not debate, but it is about how BBM positions himself with respect to those superpowers too, and how that also positions himself domestically as a strongman with the military relationship that was complex, as I discussed earlier in this debate. All right, for all of the people watching this video, I just want to end. This is a good mental model. What is the bottom line? What insight have I learned after making 3 different sets of participants have to suffer through another Philippine BBM motion? Well, it's simply that, 1, it's actually so fun to see people learn more about the Philippines and apply it a lot more in their debates, because it's such a good mental model that can be used for multiple internal dynamics and other debates. And secondly, it's quite an interesting balancing act to make an info slide and only just put enough information for a good and deep debate, while still rewarding teams for having the specialized knowledge that are quite reachable and replicable if they are truly matter loaded and they learn from these motions. And yes, of course, I mean, please, like, if you are reading about all the other countries in the world, like, this is just one of the other countries that I think you can also learn a lot from. And because I come from that country, well, I mean, I hope that you learned a lot from this video too. All right, that's it for today's video. Thanks and have a great day. Bye bye.